Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Module 33 lecture. We spent the last two modules, 31 and 32, talking about memory in general and how we remember things. Now, this module is just the opposite. We're going to talk about how and why our memory fails and why we forget things. So as you remember, there's three stages to memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And if our memory fails us, it's because there's a problem in one of those three stages. So first we're going to talk about amnesia. We probably all know the word from seeing it in the movies, from people who can't remember things. So that's the more common form of amnesia, when you can't remember your past, is called retrograde amnesia. Right? It's retro, it's old. You can't remember the old things. That's a retrieval issue. A less commonly known but equally common form of amnesia is the inability to form new memories. That's called anterograde amnesia. Both could be the result of an injury to the head, but sometimes sometimes these head injuries give you anterograde amnesia, where you know your entire past, everything up until the head injury, but then you can't make new memories. Or you may have the opposite, retrograde, where you don't know your past at all. Right? You have no recollection of things before the injury, but you can still make new memories normally. So let's talk about, so amnesia is kind of like an exception. Most people don't experience amnesia. Most people don't have injuries to the head or brain damage. For the average person, though, there often is the most common form of forgetting is actually not forgetting at all. It's when there's an encoding failure. That means the information never got into your long-term memory in the first place. So you can call that forgetting if you want, but a better term is it just was never fully processed. Like the phone number example that we gave today. Let's say you call a pizza place and the number is 555-8376. You might repeat that over and over to yourself as you're dialing the pizza place, but even 5 minutes later, once you've ordered your pizza, that number's not important to you. It'll never leave your working a short-term memory, never reach your long-term memory. So that's not really forgetting per se. It just was never fully encoded. Right? So we cannot remember what we have not encoded. Another example would be you're in school, you're in class, and I teach you that the thalamus is the hub of the brain, right? The sensory hub. If you don't know that on a test, it could be because you knew it and forgot it, or you just weren't paying attention. You were talking to your friend in class while I taught that. It was never encoded into your long-term memory. So storage decay. So remember, we said encoding, storage, and retrieval. If we practice things day after day, right? We do we do distributed practice instead of mass practice. We're going to learn things and retain things well. But look at this chart here. Let's say we learn something on February 1st, and we don't really practice it that much. When we get to February 4th or 5th, we've already lost about more than half of it, and then it kind of levels off. So the Ebbinghaus curve, Ebbinghaus studied forgetting, and you study at the first few days after learning something is when you would forget the most. But if you practice it a lot in those few days, it helps you salvage a lot of it. Right, here's another example, same thing. 100% is what you start with of vocabulary words that were maintained. And right, so in this example, actually, we're talking about completing a Spanish course. Maybe if you could think of your Latin, since we didn't take Spanish here at Maspeth, and this is number of time in years after completion. You'll see that within there's a sharp drop off your first couple years after high school. Then it pretty much levels off. So whatever you remember of Latin by the time you're 23 will roughly be what you remember the rest of your life. A slight drop from there, onward into your older adulthood. All right, so we talked about encoding. We talked about storage. Now we have to talk about retrieval. This is where we have what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where the information is in your brain. It's been encoded, check. It's been stored successfully, check. But you just can't get it back out, right? It's been encoded. You just can't get it back out to your working memory to say out loud the name of that person that you met. You know, you met this person 6 months ago. You encoded their name in your long-term memory. It was stored there for the past 6 months. You just can't get it out. That's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And so that would apply more to, remember what we learned yesterday, recall versus recognition. Retrieval failure is much more common when we have to do recall, like a fill in the blank test. If we have the opportunity for a recognition test, like multiple choice, then maybe we'll be able to pull it out because it is in there. It's just that it's hard for us to, get it off the tip of our tongue. All right, another type of retrieval failure, something that happens that might get in your way of remembering information that's in your brain, is interference. There's two types. There's proactive and retroactive. So proactive interference is when past learning disrupts your recall of new learning. So let's say you took sociology in 11th grade. I know we don't offer that at Mass Smith, but for example, 11th grade you took sociology. And now as a senior, of course, you're taking AP Psych. Since the terms are somewhat similar, if your 11th grade, having learned sociology in 11th grade, interferes with your memory of your psychology terms from 12th grade, that would be proactive interference. The old is coming forward, right? Proactive interfere with the new. Retroactive is just the opposite. So let's say next year you take biology. You take biology in college, and since biology is somewhat similar to some units of psychology, if the new learning, when you learn biology next year, caused you to forget about the old stuff the stuff you're learning now, psychology, that would be retroactive interference. So proactive is the old comes forward and interferes with the new. Retroactive is the new stuff. What you're learning right now in 2018 goes back and gets in your way of remembering older stuff that you learned. If you learn two different languages, that works really well. You're learning Spanish this year, learning French next year. Well, next year, that French is going to have retroactive interference to make you forget your Spanish. Okay, so this is a very controversial, touchy issue. We learned back when we talked about Freud that repression, according to Freud, was the master defense mechanism. So for many reasons, Freudian psychology is not viewed as so valid today, but one of them is that repression, especially in the case of abuse or trauma, is not as common as we once thought. In fact, we know that trauma often leads to flashbacks, and flashbacks are the opposite of repression, right? The image is too much burned in your brain, it's not forgotten about. So there's a lot of information here. The main thing to remember is that there's a debate over repression and how much it actually is a thing. What we have here on the right, this information over here is not in terms of repression. This is for everything, right? Let's go to the example we had in class the other day. You are staring at all 40 kids in class and what all of them are wearing. That goes into your sensory memory, your iconic memory. Iconic is your visual sensory memory. Then, a split second later, most of the information is gone. What's left? The few items that you're still consciously paying attention to. Then, long term, what's left? Even a smaller amount. Only things that you were paying attention to and that you kind of encoded on some deep, meaningful way. That, you noticed someone was wearing a scarf that reminded you of your grandmother's scarf before she passed away. Something very meaningful that would get stored not just for a few minutes, like over here, but for, forever potentially, for a long period of time. And then you want to try to get that information out of your long-term memory. Well, only some of that will be able to be retrieved, right? Depending on if there's proactive interference, retroactive interference, if there's any other thing distracting you at the time, you might not be able to retrieve that information. All right, so here, this Loftus study, teaches us two things. One, We are not as good at remembering as being eyewitnesses as we think we are. We often engage in a misinformation effect. We incorporate misleading information into our memories of an event. And that especially happens if there is framing. Now, framing doesn't mean like, framing someone for a crime and making it seem like they did it. Framing is about the way you ask questions. A leading question is framing, right? If you say, about how fast were the cars were going when they smashed into each other, instead of saying hit, people will estimate a higher speed. Because smashed is just like a more violent, strong word than hit. And people then would say, oh, it was 50 miles an hour. When you say hit or collided, they might say 30 miles an hour. All right, one more type of memory failure for today, source amnesia. So, also called source misattribution. It does not mean that you have an actual amnesia about the event. It means that you forget where you heard it. I heard that there was, I remember learning that, the president of the 13th president of the United States was Abraham Lincoln, whatever, but I forget where I learned that. I learned that in 4th grade or 5th grade. Did I learn from this teacher or that teacher? I heard this fact, but what newspaper did I read it in? That's source amnesia. Other phenomenon is deja vu. When cues from a current situation unconsciously trigger retrieval of an earlier experience, right? It provides that says, wait, haven't I experienced this before? So many people think it's this like supernatural event. Oftentimes, it could be something it's triggering retrieval of an earlier experience that's not quite in your conscious awareness. It's been stored there, but you can't retrieve it consciously. So that's why you feel like you're experiencing it again. But there's a perfectly logical explanation for that. You actually did experience it the first time, and you're experiencing something similar this time around. Okay, so again, to finish up for today, we know that memory is not perfect, nowhere near perfect. Eyewitness testimony is very flawed, and that's why it should not be relied on solely in legal matters. Alright, so when we talk about, this is an area that we're not going to discuss in too much detail, it won't be on your test, but just to know that when we talk about memories of abuse, they are not always as accurate as we would like them to be. We definitely don't want to invalidate the experience of someone who has experienced a trauma or abuse. At the same time, we have to know that memories from long ago might not be as perfectly vivid and memorable as we like to think they are. So just general tips for improving our memory. This is in every situation. Rehearse, right? Relearning effect. Make the material meaningful and code it semantically. Use retrieval cues. Use mnemonic devices. Minimize interference. Sleep more, because sleep helps with memory. And test your own knowledge, right? You don't know what you don't know until you test yourself.